After my grandfather Thomas's death, I discovered that his entire estate, $500 million, was now under my father David's control. But the will was more complicated than he thought. In order to access the money, David had to work with us, completing a project we were to carry out as co-executors. Despite his attempts to manipulate the situation, I took charge, becoming the face of the project that would transform the city. Every step brought me closer to fulfilling my grandfather's wish, and I realized that victory wasn't just about money, but about making a real difference. At the grand opening of the new center, with all eyes on me, I understood that now I had the power to change my life, leaving behind my father's manipulation and control. The rain had been pouring nonstop since morning, and by the time we stepped out of St. Matthew's Church, the heavy gray sky in Charleston felt like it had settled deep into my bones. Thomas Carter wasn't just my grandfather. He had been the steady voice in my life when it often felt like everything else was ruled by harsh words and long silences. The service had been quiet, respectful, and filled with faces of people from the community Thomas had given so much to. My father, David, stood right at the front, accepting condolences like a seasoned politician during election season. His handshakes were firm, his smile carefully controlled. For a moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, grief had softened him. But that hope quickly faded. Hours later, with the mourners gone and the lingering smell of damp flowers still in the air, I found myself sitting in the estate's drawing room, sipping lukewarm coffee and staring at the old oak mantel where Thomas used to rest his arm while telling me his stories. David walked in, his expression stripped of the politeness he'd been wearing all day. "It's done," he said in that flat, detached way of his. "The estate transfer's official. 500 million. Locked in my name." He said it with the same tone you'd used to talk about the weather, then let a small, almost smug smirk curl across his face. I nodded slowly, unsure of what exactly he was expecting from me. He didn't give me time to figure it out. "You're useless now," he said, and for a second, I couldn't even process what he'd just said. "Excuse me?" I barely managed. "You've coasted long enough," he continued, his voice cutting through the air with an edge that stung. "Pack your things. I want you out of the house by morning." For a moment, it was like my hands weren't even mine. This was my father, the same man who had taught me to ride a bike, who'd lectured me endlessly about ambition, and now he was looking at me as if I was some piece of old furniture. I stood up, forcing my back straight even though my chest felt tight. "Fine," I said, keeping my voice steady. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of hearing me break. I walked out of the room, the sound of my footsteps echoing down the long hallway toward the bedroom that had never quite felt like mine. I'd grown up in a house where silence was the strongest form of control. David's rules were strict and unyielding. No slamming doors, no talking back, and above all, never, ever question his decisions. My earliest memories of him were nothing but a long series of corrections, my posture too slouched, my tone too sharp, my ambitions always too unrealistic. By the time I was 12, I'd learned to keep any achievements to myself. If I brought home an A, he'd ask me why it wasn't an A+. If I won an award, he'd casually wonder how many other kids hadn't even bothered to compete. Praise, when it came, felt more like a footnote than anything close to a celebration. Thomas, though, was different. His presence felt like stepping into a warm patch of sunlight after being cooped up indoors for too long. He didn't push me to be perfect. He just asked me what I wanted and really listened when I answered. When I was 14, I told him I wanted to work in finance, to understand the forces behind money and power. David scoffed, saying it was a man's world, but Thomas just smiled and encouraged me to learn everything I could. Years later, when I got into a competitive graduate program, David dismissed it as a pointless waste of time and money. I still remember sitting on the porch with Thomas that night, my acceptance letter in my lap, wondering if I should turn it down. Thomas quietly slid an envelope across the table to me, inside of which was a cashier's check large enough to cover my tuition for the first year. "Don't tell him," Thomas said softly. "This is just between us. Consider it an investment in someone worth investing in." That was Thomas, believing in me when it meant something. Now, standing in my childhood bedroom with a half-packed suitcase, I thought back to that night and the quiet pride in his eyes. David could take the house from me, but he could never take away the foundation Thomas had given me. As I reached for another hanger, something hard shifted behind the lining of my old bookshelf. The house didn't feel like mine anymore. In just a few days after the funeral, the warmth Thomas had brought to the estate seemed to vanish, replaced by a sharp, cold emptiness. Doors that were always left open were now locked. The library, the sunroom, even the small study where Thomas kept his records, every handle rattled uselessly when I tried them. The staff, people I'd known for years, suddenly seemed to avoid making eye contact with me. Helen, the housekeeper who used to sneak me scones from the kitchen, now only gave me stiff nods, keeping busy with tasks that didn't even need doing. When I asked if something was wrong, she simply muttered, "Mr. Carter's instructions," before quickly hurrying off. At dinner, David acted like I wasn't even there, discussing his plans for moving forward with an air of finality. He talked about renovations, new investments, and streamlining the household in a way that made it painfully clear I wasn't part of his vision. His voice had that satisfied tone, like someone cutting away what they saw as unnecessary dead weight. Back in my room, I tried to focus on packing. My fingers brushed against the spines of old books I'd kept since high school, those little bits of comfort I turned to when I needed a place to hide my thoughts. One thick biography Thomas had given me on my 20th birthday slid forward more easily than the others. When I pulled it free, I felt something small and solid shift inside the pages. I opened the book, and tucked deep between the last few pages was a sealed envelope. My name, written in Thomas's steady hand, stood out sharply against the cream-colored paper. I sat on the edge of the bed and carefully tore the seal. Inside, there was a single sheet of stationery with faint but deliberate ink. "The will protects those who protect others." No explanation, no context, just that one line, heavy enough to stop me in my tracks. I read it again, tracing the words as if trying to find something more hidden beneath the surface. Thomas had left this for me to find, not David, not anyone else. I folded the note back into the envelope and slid it into my bag, my mind already spinning with what it might mean. David's studies smelled the same as it always had, cigar smoke and polished leather, but now it felt colder, empty. He sat behind the massive mahogany desk, leaning back in Thomas's old chair like it had always belonged to him. A crystal tumbler of bourbon sat beside him, half full, catching the light from the desk lamp. "Sit," he ordered without looking up. I didn't move until he finally raised his eyes, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I suppose you've heard," he started, as if the entire city wasn't already buzzing about it. 500 million. All mine. Thomas was generous. His voice held no trace of grief, only the satisfaction of someone who'd just won a game they rigged in their favor. I stayed silent, letting the words hang in the air. "You've had a long, comfortable stay here," he continued, his tone now cold. "But you're not a child anymore. You're a financial burden. And frankly, you've been coasting." He said it like a final judgment, not an opinion. I almost laughed. I'd been working since I was 17, paying my way through most of grad school with help from Thomas, not him. But arguing now felt pointless, like shouting into the wind. "I want you out by morning," he said, leaning forward, elbows on the desk. "No drama, no long-winded goodbyes. This is my house now, and I decide who belongs here." His eyes stayed fixed on me, waiting for a crack, a flinch, any sign of protest. I felt the weight of Thomas's note burning in my pocket. "The will protects those who protect others." I straightened my back. "Fine." No tremor in my voice, no hesitation. I stood, turned, and walked out without another word. Upstairs, I finished packing the last of my clothes into the worn leather suitcase Thomas had given me years ago. The envelope stayed safely in my coat pocket. I wasn't about to let it out of my sight. By the time the grandfather clock chimed 9, my bags were by the door. I didn't look back when I stepped out into the cool Charleston night. By the next afternoon, I was hauling my suitcase up the narrow stairs of a brick walk-up in downtown Charleston. The apartment was barely big enough to stretch my arms without hitting the walls, but it was mine, no locked doors, no eyes watching me, no pressure to measure up. I'd sold a few pieces of jewelry David had given me over the years, gifts more for show than sentiment. The cash wasn't much, but it was enough to cover the deposit and my first month's rent. My job as a financial analyst allowed me to work remotely, so I set up my laptop on the tiny kitchen table and stuck to a steady routine, forcing some semblance of normalcy into the chaos. Still, at night, I'd pull the envelope from my coat pocket and reread Thomas's words. The will protects those who protect others. It didn't sound like something he'd say offhand, and it definitely didn't feel like a message meant for David. I began digging public records, probate filings, even old news articles about estates with unusual clauses. Most of it was noise, but every so often, I'd find something that made my pulse quicken: trusts that only released funds under specific conditions, wills tied to joint ventures or community projects. Thomas had been meticulous in everything he did, and it was possible, even likely, that his will carried that same precision. 3 days after I moved in, my phone lit up with an unfamiliar number. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me swipe to answer. Victoria Carter? A crisp, professional voice greeted me, laced with a hint of dry amusement. Yes, this is Rachel Green. I was your grandfather's attorney. There was a pause, deliberate. We should talk about his will. It's unusual. I could hear the satisfaction in her voice, like she was holding back from saying more until we met face to face. I sat up straighter. How unusual? I asked. She gave a short, knowing laugh. Let's just say your father's week is about to get a lot more complicated. Can you come to my office tomorrow? I glanced at the envelope on the table, my mind already racing ahead. Rachel Green's office was nothing like I expected. There were no polished mahogany desks or antique rugs, just clean lines, muted colors, and a wall of neatly labeled files. She motioned for me to sit across from her desk, folding her hands neatly in front of her, studying me with that look, like she already knew more than she was letting on. I've been waiting for you to call, she started. Your grandfather anticipated certain dynamics in this family. I raised an eyebrow. Meaning my father? I asked. Exactly, she replied, pulling a thick binder closer. Thomas placed his entire estate in a trust. David can't access a single cent of the $500 million unless specific conditions are met. My heart rate quickened as I leaned in. What conditions? She smiled, just enough to show she'd been expecting that question. He must complete a community redevelopment project that gets approval from the city and meets Thomas's philanthropic standards, and he must do it with you as co-executor. Equal authority, equal signature rights. I leaned back, trying to process. You're saying he can't do it without me? I asked. Correct. But there's more. She flipped to the final page of the clause. During the 14 months it takes to complete the project, there can be no lawsuits between you and David, no public estrangement, and no formal withdrawal from the arrangement by either party. If any of those terms are violated, the trust dissolves. I blinked, trying to take it all in. And the money? I asked. Half will go to the charities Thomas named, and the other half will go directly to you. For a moment, there was only the soft hum of the air conditioner. I thought of David sitting in his study, smugly certain that he had already won, telling me I was useless. Thomas really planned this? I whispered. He wanted to make sure the person he trusted most was in a position to protect his legacy, Rachel said, her voice matter of fact. And that person wasn't your father. I traced the edge of the desk with my fingers, a slow, deliberate motion. When does David find out? I asked. Rachel's smile widened, just a little. He already has. My chest tightened. A steady, cold anticipation settled in. Then I suppose I should be expecting a knock at my door. It didn't take long, less than 24 hours after leaving Rachel's office. A sharp knock at my apartment door. When I opened it, there he was, David, dressed in an expensive suit, but with the edges starting to fray. His face was pale, sweat dotting his hairline. Victoria, he said, forcing a smile. Thought we should talk, family to family. I stepped aside without a word, letting him into the cramped living room. He glanced around, his eyes lingering on the second-hand furniture like it was a personal insult. The bank tells me there's been a misunderstanding, he began, settling onto the sofa. Funds are tied up in some sort of trust. Ridiculous red tape. His tone was light, but I could hear the strain beneath it. It's not a misunderstanding, I said. It's the will. He waved a dismissive hand. Your grandfather was sentimental. I'm sure we can work around it. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. You and I, blood is blood. We've had our differences, but we can come together now. Make this work for both of us. Thomas's words flickered in my mind. Don't react. Negotiate. What exactly are you proposing? I asked evenly. That you sign whatever's needed so I can move forward, he said, his voice smooth. You'll get something. Of course. I held his gaze, unblinking. That's not how it's written. His smile thinned. Victoria, I'm offering you a way to make this painless. You think you can run a multi-million-dollar project without me? You'll sink us both. The threat was there, coiled just beneath the surface of his words. But I didn't flinch. If you want the money, I said, you'll follow the terms. All of them. A muscle in his jaw twitched. For a moment, I thought he might lose it. But instead, he stood up, straightening his jacket. Think about it, he said, then walked out without another word or glance. I closed the door behind him, already knowing I wouldn't need to lock it. He'd be back. 2 days after our first meeting, I had the agreement ready. Rachel helped me refine it, making sure every clause was as precise as Thomas's will. David would publicly acknowledge me as co-executor, cover my living expenses for the duration of the project, and transfer 3 specific estate properties into my name, outright, no conditions, no reversals. When I slid the document across Rachel's conference table, David skimmed it, then flicked his gaze up to me. You can't be serious. His arms crossed, he leaned back in his chair. I'm not signing this. You're extorting me. I didn't blink. The will is extorting you, I replied. I'm just giving you a way forward. For the next week, he stalled, claimed he was busy, sent back pages with red ink scrawled across the margins, even consulted another lawyer. But after one meeting, that sharp-suited man quietly confirmed what I already knew. Thomas's language was airtight. Without my cooperation, David's $500 million might as well have been buried in the ground. When David finally returned to Rachel's office, he was quieter. Not defeated exactly, but something in his posture had shifted. There was a weight in his movements, a tightness in his mouth. He picked up the pen, rolled it between his fingers, and signed each page with quick, sharp strokes. Rachel notarized the agreement with her usual professionalism, but as she handed the final packet to me, I caught a fleeting glimmer in her eyes, satisfaction, maybe even a hint of mischief. David, his knuckles white, shoved the signed papers toward me with a look that could have cut glass. I hope you know what you're doing, he muttered, the words loaded with something far darker than concern. Victoria, he said, his voice a little too soft. I do, I replied, calmly tucking the agreement into my folder. There was nothing more to say. We stood in that charged silence, heavy with everything unspoken between us. He didn't extend a hand, and without another word, he left. The door clicked shut with finality, and for the first time in years, I felt the balance shift, not just in terms of paperwork, but power. And I knew, deep down, it was only the beginning. The waterfront lot was an eyesore when we started, cracked asphalt, weeds growing like nature had given up. But Thomas had a vision, one that could breathe life back into that land. Glass walls opening to the harbor, classrooms for job training, a space for local markets on weekends. I dove into every detail. The contractors came to me for decisions, city officials for approvals, and slowly, I became the face of the project. Every morning, I walked the site with the crew. Every night, I reviewed invoices and budgets with a laser focus, making sure everything stayed on track with Thomas's plan. David hated it. He was always late to meetings, floating ideas to cut costs that would have gutted the whole project, ideas that disregarded both the building codes and Thomas's values. Whenever I shut him down, he muttered about me being impossible to work with. But he couldn't shut me out. Not without breaking the terms of the will. The thing was, the more I pushed back, the more the workers and officials started to respect me. It wasn't just the family name anymore, it was my decisions that carried weight. And David? He watched it all happen, like a man stuck on the sidelines, trying to figure out how to take credit for something he couldn't control. The press ate up the story. Carter family unites to honor patriarch's dream. They photographed us side by side, smiling for the cameras, the glossy spreads making it look like we were a team. But behind those smiles, every conversation was a negotiation, a game of power. By month 11, the steel frame of the center was up, its glass panels catching the sun like it had always belonged there. David and I stood together on the balcony, watching crews set the final supports into place. "You've handled yourself better than I expected," he said. His voice clipped, but I could hear the reluctant respect in it. "Better than you wanted," I replied, eyes still on the worksite below. "Maybe," he murmured, giving a short, humorless laugh. It wasn't trust. It wasn't forgiveness. But it was an acknowledgement, grudging yet real, that I wasn't the liability he'd once painted me to be. In a few weeks, we'd be finished. The project complete. The will's conditions met. He would get his fortune, and I would get something different. The ribbon-cutting ceremony drew an enormous crowd, too big for the courtyard, spilling out into the sidewalk. City leaders, reporters, families from the neighborhood, all gathered under a bright spring sky. The new community center gleamed behind us, its sleek glass catching the light like a monument to something bigger than either of us. David stood next to me, hands clasped, a smile plastered across his face. The cameras loved him, but the speeches weren't his to give. Not anymore. That was Thomas's stipulation and mine. When it was my turn, I stepped up to the podium, feeling the weight of the moment settle around me like a cloak. "Thomas believed that wealth meant nothing unless it lifts others," I said, my voice steady. "He believed in giving people opportunities, not just handouts. This community center is his dream, and it's your legacy now." I thanked the contractors, the volunteers, the community that had worked alongside us. I didn't mention David. I didn't need to. The applause started slow, hesitant, but soon grew into something steady, warm, rolling over the courtyard like a wave. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw David's expression tighten, his jaw clenching as the focus stayed firmly on me. For a second, I almost smiled because this moment was mine. By the end of the day, the trust's conditions were fulfilled. The project was complete. David would have his $500 million. But I had something different. 3 prime estate properties were now in my name, outright, no conditions, no reversals. And the public credit for bringing Thomas's vision to life, something he could never take from me. As the crowd began to disperse, I slipped away down the side path, my heels clicking against the new brickwork. The center stood behind me, alive with voices, buzzing with the energy of the people it was built to serve. Exactly as Thomas had imagined. I didn't look back at David. I didn't need to. But just as I reached the back gate, I heard a voice, smooth and familiar. "You really think you've won, don't you?" David's voice, low, dangerous, was like a snake slithering behind me. I turned to face him. The smugness in his eyes had shifted to something darker, something almost desperate. "I don't need to win, David," I said, my voice even. "I just need to leave the past behind." You're still stuck in it." His face twisted, but he didn't respond. Instead, he stared at me, as if trying to read me, trying to understand what had shifted. I walked away, and this time I didn't look back. But I knew he would. David had underestimated me every step of the way. And that was his greatest mistake.